Greetings. Welcome to the Psych 487 Capstone lecture on Neobehaviorism. I'm Dr. Eric Landrum from the Department of Psychology. So, on the heels of our behaviorism lecture posted on YouTube, here are the foundations of Neobehaviorism, which is really just the system of psychology that followed after behaviorism, and it's not a clear demarcation between one and the other. There's probably like a evolutionary change over time, and really, as you'll see here in momentarily, that it's predominantly all about B.F. Skinner and what Skinner did from the foundations of Watson and behaviorism. He takes to a whole different, another level, so to speak, in neo-behaviorism. And by the end of neo-behaviorism, we're actually laying the foundations for the beginnings and birth of cognitive psychology, which is not really technically called an ism as of today. There's really not a popular dominant theory today, but I'm getting ahead of myself. So anyway, back to neo-behaviorism and its foundations. After the turn of the 19th century into the 20th century, as we go from the beginnings and the more popularization of physics, for example, you can see that this notion of operationism really gets it started in the late 1920s with Percy Bridgman from physics. And so, and psychologists, to a great extent in that period of time, had physics envy to a large extent. So operationism discusses the validity of scientific findings dependent upon operations used to derive at those findings. That kind of sounds like, so what does that mean? Essentially, physicists were, and still today are, quite good at using formulas to describe physical events that happen in the world around us. And so maybe some of the most common ones that you've ever heard of is E equals mc squared and F equals ma, and that's force equals mass times acceleration. Well, and that was the notion of operationism. And so we can define force in a way by which its component processes can be multiplied with one another. And so there was a formula that underlies this event that happens in the real world, which is force. Well, psychologists at the time very much liked that notion of operationism. And so out of operationism comes the idea in psychology, as you can see here at the bottom of the screen, operational definition. And so physicists were quite good about having these physical concepts be defined in precise terms. And so rather than just talk about force and mass and gravity and things like that, there were formulas. We could define these numerically in a way to get at actually a force score on a certain scale, or, the effect of gravity and acceleration, 32 feet per second per second. And so, physicists were quite good at taking these complex notions and turning them into formulae that could be used to describe them. And so, and psychology will take from behaviorism and Psychology will take from behaviorism and neo-behaviorism that exact same notion and run with the ball. And so, and this essentially, this third bullet right here that I'm pointing at the moment is really going to become a huge philosophy in psychology, especially espoused by B.F. Skinner. So if it can't be observed, measured, or manipulated, it has no use, no relevance for science. That didn't mean it didn't exist, but that meant that it just wasn't something that scientists would study. And so B.F. Skinner would not deny the notion of consciousness or memory or feelings and emotions. He would just say that they're not the purview of psychology. If we can't observe it, we can't measure it, we can't manipulate it, then it's really not something that scientists can study. It has no relevance for science. And so out of this notion from Percy Bridgman in 1927 in physics, psychology is going to come up with its own variation on this, which we call still to this day an operational definition, which is this last bullet here on the screen, which is that every abstract concept must be defined in terms of the procedures used to measure the concept. And so if we want to study hunger from a neo-behavioristic viewpoint, especially towards the end of neo-behaviorism, when Skinner's really influence falls out of vogue, we can study hunger so long as we define it in such a way that we can get a score, that it's observable, it's quantifiable, it's measurable. And so that's going to be that little translational piece in the history of psychology where we can go from purely observable public events to studying more private, internal, cognitive events, if you will. As long as we can operationally define whatever we're interested in a method by which we have procedures by which to quantify it, measure it, observe it, count it, analyze it, then it becomes appropriate for the study of neo-behaviorists and clearly continuing into cognitive psychology as it's popularized today. All right, so, and this connecting notion, this translational piece, actually has a formal name in the history of psychology. You can see that now. It's called logical positivism. So now theoretical concepts can be examined as long as they are operationally defined. And so you go back to Auguste Comte in the 1700s in France, and you can look at positivism, where we get this notion that physics is going to run with, that only publicly observable, undebatable behaviors were the subject matter of psychology. And then logical positivism follows that and allows for theory formation as long as the terms are explicitly defined. And so now the study of psychology in the Neobehaviorism movement into cognitive psychology and that transition becomes observables plus terms that are logically connected to observables. So now I can study hunger as long as I have an operational definition that makes that notion of hunger publicly observable, undebatable. And so if I go to the extent of defining hunger as something, let's say, a person's blood glucose or sucrose levels, let's go with glucose. Blood glucose levels, as long as I can measure blood glucose and get a score and it's reliable and dependable, and I can make the argument that blood glucose is a representative, a marker, if you will, for hunger, then I can say I'm studying hunger. That would be the notion. So it has to be this little translational piece between the theory and the measurement, and that whole idea of that translational piece is called logical positivism. That comes out of which was originally positivism in philosophical circles. So the neo-behaviorist movement lasts from about late 1920s, 1930 to roughly the 1960s, into the 1960s. The primary source of data in the neo-behaviorist movement is going to come from animal learning, and very clearly the most popular proponent of this is going to be B.F. Skinner, who we'll study in great detail here in just a moment. We see the acceptance of operationalism and positivism, and then we're going to see the transition to logical positivism. The core of psychology in this nearly 2-decade span, or nearly 4-decade span, is the core of psychology is going to be the study of learning. And so, and really it's going to take its shape from classical and operant conditioning. So those approaches that we've discussed in previous YouTube lectures are going to be center stage really from the 1930s through the 1960s. In fact, the strict neo-behaviorists, a guy like B.F. Skinner, for example, is going to have the notion that all behavior can be described in terms of conditioning. Again, either classical conditioning or operant conditioning. Later down the road, we're going to have Albert Bandura at Stanford University add to that, and he's going to add notions and theories about observational learning that can be linked in some ways to the conditioning paradigm. And so this is really going to be the essence of that neo-behavioristic movement. And so this methodological behaviorism, it's okay to study higher mental processes and problem solving and cognition as long as we have the operational definitions. And again, that's that contribution of logical positivism. It makes these internal states now studyable by psychologists as long as we have the proper definitions that take these internal states, and then we externalize them. So that's the notion here in the neo-behaviorist movement. So here you have a picture of B.F. Skinner towards the end of his life. He lives from 1904 to 1990. And really, in the history of psychology, when historians study Skinner, they tend to put him very similar to the same type of intellectual capacity and variety of interests as Galton, who we've studied previously, who was a cousin of Charles Darwin. And so B.F. Skinner wrote about society and how society should live. He wrote Walden and Walden 2. He has a program of behavior control. He develops an infant crib that the apocryphal story is that he helps raise his own daughter in that the air crib, as you'll see if you ever do the internet search on that. He develops teaching machines. He was really one of the founders of behavior modification in this whole system of, operant conditioning and reinforcers and reinforcements and things like that. And so he's going to have a huge interest and impact in psychology to this day, even though, and by the way, there are still behaviorists out there. Behaviorism is alive and well on certain fronts. If you talk to your colleagues who do therapy, you'll hear about a cognitive behavioral approach. Behaviorism is still, in many ways, a superior method for helping people overcome things like simple phobias. And so even though there may be not a lot of behaviorists, although there still are some, there are still societies that are devoted to study behaviorism and for behaviorists. It's not going to be the predominant paradigm today. That's really going to be shared between cognitive psychology and really a neuroscience approach, which has just hugely taken over this notion of studying human behavior from a scientific perspective. And so, but behaviorism still has as vestiges today in what we do currently within psychology. So the basic notion that B.F. Skinner is going to promote is that all aspects of life can be traced to environmental sources alone. And what he would call the strict term would be a metaphysical behaviorist, where there's no consciousness. And that's really kind of a little bit of a misnomer. It's not that B.F. Skinner didn't believe in consciousness. He believed that it was not the purview of psychology, that psychology as the science of behavior should not be studying things that are not directly observable, quantifiable, and undebatable. And so Skinner would label himself as a metaphysical behaviorist. There's no consciousness. We don't study that. We only study what's directly observable and quantifiable. And as you'll find, if you read a little bit about Skinner, he worked with rats, he worked with pigeons, very much so comparative approach where we can learn a great deal about human behavior by the study of animal behavior. And so he gets his PhD from Harvard in 1931. He has a long and active career and dies in 1990. And so really the essence of what Skinner is going to propose throughout his theories and ideas throughout the course of his life is that man's a machine and that machines behave in lawful and predictable ways in response to external stimuli. And so it kind of reminds me of Watson's famous quote, give me a dozen healthy infants, and I can take them and shape them any way I want to. And Skinner took that further to the nth degree. So if you give me complete control over the environment by which someone is raised, either an animal or a human being, really didn't matter to Skinner, I can control the inputs and the outputs in such a way that that animal or human being can have predictable outcomes and predictable behaviors. And so it's all about, again, this SR psychology, stimulus response. And as long as I can control the environment, I can shape certain behaviors. I can use the principles of classical and operant conditioning, and for Skinner, mostly operant conditioning, to get the behaviors that I would like to see, given the response to a certain stimulus in the environment. And so Skinner used a very different approach than what would be used by most psychologists today. Skinner used an idiographic research approach, which is the idea that you study only a small handful of participants, maybe only even one person or one animal. And so, behavior was thought to be fairly universal by Skinner. So there wasn't a need to study, 70 people in a treatment group and 70 people in the control group. If you're doing some sort of behavior change study, I didn't need to have, 40 rats in group A and 40 rats in group B. I only need one or two rats in one or two humans and study them into a great deal, study them highly in depth, really analogous to a case study approach, and then I can draw some generalizations from those behaviors to others if I want to. Although I've got to tell you, from Skinner's perspective, that's not what he wanted to do. I mean, we tend to do that. We do a study with 200 people because we want to extrapolate those findings to 2,000 people, but that wasn't Skinner's approach. Skinner was good with, I'm going to study 3 pigeons. I'm going to publish a paper on 3 pigeons, and then I'm done. I'm not even going to generalize this to other pigeons. What's the point? I mean, if you kind of believe that behavior is universal, we don't deal a lot with inferential statistics. We don't deal with generalizations and inferences and estimates. And so this was a very different approach for Skinner and behaviorists and neo-behaviorists at the time. So just to kind of give you an example, and if you remember good old chapter 6, probably from your stereotypical introductory psychology textbook, you've already studied this in psychology. If you had our course in the department on learning, you've clearly already studied this, maybe even talked about it a little bit in your cognitive psychology class. It's hard to know sometimes. And so just to kind of give you just a really brief refresher, some of the terminology that was popularized by Skinner and other behaviorists at the time. So in terms of conditioning terminology, so reinforcement, and again, and to be honest with you, Skinner got a little bit criticized in his career because it seemed to be so circular. Reinforcement is the result of a stimulus consequence that increases the strength of an emitted response. And so a reinforcer occurs when a response gets strengthened. So you do something, you like the outcome, so there's a behavior and a consequence. So you behave in a certain way. There's a consequence. You like that behavior. You like that consequence. That behavior tends to get strengthened. And so that notion, so a reinforcer, and by the way, either a positive or a negative reinforcer is always going to be working to strengthen behavior. Shaping was another classic notion that comes from Skinner, where you reinforce successive approximations towards a goal behavior. And so a baby just doesn't get up one day and start walking around. There are certain steps that lead a baby to have success in walking. And so the baby learns how to balance its head by looking up on all fours. The baby learns to crawl. The baby learns to hold itself up against an object and learns balance. And eventually, after enough repetitions and trial and error, the baby will learn to take its first step on its own balance, on its own 2 feet, and that happens over a series of successive approximations. In fact, there's probably a number of steps where the baby loses balance or falls backwards or falls down, and so we learn over time by getting closer and closer to a goal behavior. By the way, it's the exact same way that all of us learn throughout our lives, and so in college, hopefully you were given multiple steps before you wrote that very first research methods paper. You didn't write the whole first draft of the paper, the night before the final exam. Hopefully you wrote the introduction section and got some feedback. Then you wrote the method section. Then you wrote the results section. Then you wrote the discussion section. And hopefully with successive approximations, your instructors got you towards that goal behavior of being able to write in APA format. And so we still teach this way today. We still learn this way today. The notions of reinforcement and shaping are still central to our understanding of how individuals learn. So just to give you a little bit more on the terminology, because sometimes it's highly confusing, especially to introductory psychology students. So positive reinforcement, where a behavior leads to reinforcing consequence. And the goal of positive reinforcement, as you can see here in all caps I have for you on the screen, is strengthening behavior. So the example I like to use is that if you do your homework, I will give you some ice cream. Now, by the way, this contingency only works if you like ice cream. If you're allergic to ice cream, if you're lactose intolerant, then ice cream's not going to be a reinforcer for you. But for many people, ice cream's going to be a reinforcer. And so if you do your homework, then you'll get some ice cream. So there's a positive contingency in there. The goal is to strengthen homework doing behavior. And so if, in fact, the person likes ice cream, and if their behavior is strengthened, that is, their homework doing behavior is strengthened, with that contingency, then that becomes a positive reinforcement situation. An example of another term is negative reinforcement, where the behavior leads to the avoidance or termination of something unpleasant, and that also strengthens behavior. And this is probably one of the most common confusions of introductory psychology students, because they see positive, they think negative, and they think opposites. Well, there is some opposition in these definitions, but they both, as you can see in caps, they both have the goal of strengthening behavior. And this is the confusion for students. So in negative reinforcement, using our homework analogy, would be, if you do your homework, you won't be grounded this weekend. Or if you do your homework, I won't take away your driving privileges. So you see, in this case, if driving or if not being grounded is a desirable outcome for a person, then homework behavior hopefully would be strengthened. So here it is again. If you do your homework, you won't be grounded this weekend. And that's that notion of behavior leading to the avoidance or termination of something unpleasant. So if you do your homework, you won't be grounded this weekend. That's assuming that being grounded is actually going to be something unpleasant. And for most teenagers, and for most of us, I suppose, it would be. Not that is to be grounded. Unless you're like, you go to your room and you're punished there, and you've got every technological toy on the planet there, and then it's not so much punishment then, is it? And that would be a case where this contingency wouldn't work. Maybe for some people being grounded is a pleasure, it's a joy, and in that case, this would not be negative reinforcement. So for positive reinforcement, if you do your homework, I'll give you some ice cream. Negative reinforcement, if you do your homework, you won't be grounded. Those both are intended to strengthen homework doing behavior. And so again, that positive and negative is a really common place for psychology students to get confused. Just to kind of round out the whole notion here, because usually when we talk about positive and negative reinforcement, there's also a mention of punishment. Now, punishment, as you can see by the all caps here at the top of the screen, is intended to weaken behavior. So punishment occurs when there's a behavior that leads to an aversive consequence, which is intended to decrease the strength of the response. And so the example here might be, stop watching TV. Go do your homework. Stop watching TV. Go do your homework. And so the goal here is to stop watching TV. So the goal in that scenario, in that situation, is to weaken TV watching behavior. And as you can see by the sub-bullet there, one of the problems with punishment, and by the way, punishment can be effective. There are certain contingencies and conditions by which punishment can be highly effective. Most parents, and really most of society, really doesn't follow those. They really don't follow those contingencies very well, which is why punishment is often quite ineffective. But anyway, so the problem with punishment is that it doesn't necessarily, in and of itself, increase a more positive behavior. So yeah, I can stop watching TV if I'm being punished. I'll stop watching TV. I'm going to go out on the street corner and buy and sell drugs. Thank you very much. Congratulations. You weakened my TV watching behavior, but you really didn't give me an adequate substitute. And so that's one of the problems with punishment. Decreasing one behavior doesn't guarantee the increase of another desirable behavior. And so if punishment is going to be effective, it has to be used in tandem with other behavioral approaches. And so punishment in and of itself, as most people understand it and use it, is typically fairly ineffective. And if you want to even take this to a macro level, you can think about the big picture. I mean, how well does the death penalty deter crime? How well does our prison system, in terms of that level of punishment, actually lead to a decrease in those behaviors? And if you want to play with that idea someday, look up the recidivism rate of how many people recommit a crime once they've been incarcerated for a crime. And you can make up your own mind whether or not this notion of punishment is really an effective way of changing behavior, both long and short term. Other notions of B.F. Skinner, and I'm not going to get into this too much, I'll let you read what's on the screen there. He talked a lot about in his writings and in his public presentations about free will versus determinism. He wrote some really neat books. He wrote Beyond Freedom and Dignity in 1971. He writes Walden and Walden 2. And where he actually talks about utopias. He actually talks about how might we use the principles of behavior modification and neobehaviorism to change the way we live and interact with one another in terms of environments, in terms of neighborhoods, in terms of getting along with each other. And so B.F. Skinner really takes these ideas that he formulates from his post-graduation from Harvard in 1931, and he explores them on a more macro societal level. And by the way, which is really kind of interesting and fascinating, there are actually a couple of cities in the United States that have been founded and try to operate on the principles of behaviorism and neo-behaviorism as proposed by B.F. Skinner. I'm going to shut up for a minute and just let you read that quote there on the screen from Beyond Freedom and Dignity in 1971. So if you actually believe in that notion, then it would make it would influence how you make laws, the rules, the ordinances that you might live in within a city limit or within a neighborhood. And like I say, there's been a couple of experiments and some, somewhat successful in terms of trying to develop a city or a neighborhood that's based on some of the principles that B.F. Skinner wrote about during his career. Behavior modification is a huge contribution that Skinner makes, as well as the colleagues of Skinner throughout the time of neo-behaviorism. Behavior modification is chiefly based on a system of positive reinforcement. As you can see on the screen, it's widely used to this day. It's used in mental hospitals, factories, prisons, schools to change abnormal or undesirable behavior to more desirable behaviors. So if you remember ever having in your grade school classroom a checklist, maybe it was up on the board and there was a big grid and students' names were in the rows and there were tasks in the columns. There might have been stars, there might have been smiley faces, there could have been stickers used. That was a system of behavior modification. It's used in business to reduce absenteeism, reduction of sick leave, improve job performance, and it's used in the college classroom. And so guess what? When you do an assignment in this class, you get some points. Those points accumulate. At the end of the semester, you trade those points in for a grade. That is essentially a system of behavior modification. And so with the assumption that high grade is a positive reinforcer, which, by the way, is not universal for everyone. The points or lack thereof on any given assignment hopefully is motivation that either reinforces what you're doing, or if you get a grade that's a bit lower than you want, is a motivator to change your behavior, to modify your behavior such that you can reach the reinforcers and the consequences that you want from your behavior, from your performance on a task or on a test or in a particular course. And so these are highly used and they're quite effective. That's why they've been used for, coming up on 80, 90 years now in psychology, and quite effective when used appropriately in the right conditions. So in that behavior modification system, as I've already mentioned, there's really no punishment. The goal is to create positive reinforcement scenarios. Again, sometimes that's harder than you might think. If everybody likes ice cream, that would be great, but not everyone likes ice cream. You would think that chocolate would be the universal positive reinforcer, but oddly enough, in some sort of bizarre fashion, some people don't like chocolate. I just don't get that. I don't understand that, but oh well. The people who don't like chocolate are just leaving more for the rest of us. Thank you very much. Anyway, and so it's a little bit more challenging than you might think, and especially if you're working in a hospital or a psychiatric ward where maybe people aren't completely cognizant and aware and using the mental faculties that you and I are accustomed to, you can see where, even though I can say this very glibly, it's really popular, it's used widely, it's actually a little bit more challenging than I've made it to be in this YouTube lecture. Just to kind of wrap this up and talk about some of the criticisms of neo-behaviorism, and as we've talked about all semester long, there are always contributions and criticisms of any type of system in psychology, we try to be as fair and balanced as we can with any topic that we talk about in this class. What you'll see here is what some would call extreme positivism. Sometimes you'll hear Skinner referred to as a radical neo-behaviorist, not radical in terms of like a protester, but radical in terms of taking it to the extremes. And so that the extreme positivism is going to be a criticism that others are going to launch onto neo-behaviorism, where you can only look at overt behavior. By the way, this softens over time with the onset and acceptance of logical positivism, and that way we can broaden this extreme or radical viewpoint. It's atheoretical, and so although that's kind of a misnomer sometimes, Skinner himself is not going to formulate a bunch of theories about behavior. He's not going to have theories like Freud would have had theories, or about how Adler or other personality theorists would have, Stanford Binet and Lewis Terman. He's not going to have a bunch of theories, but the ideas that he proposes and the concepts he comes up with in terms of shaping, or in terms of, the conditions of reinforcement, and schedules of reinforcement, those will lead others to have theories, but Skinner himself is going to remain fairly atheoretical, perhaps even anti-theoretical at some points in his career. Another criticism of behaviorism is that it's really too narrow, that human beings are more than the sum of their parts. It's not just all about overt behaviors. There's lots of important things that happen cognitively, emotionally, within the brain that aren't observable. And so those also should be the subject matter of psychology, although what is a criticism to neobehaviorists will often take as that's one of our pluses. We did this on purpose. We have specifically designed this system because we want to rule out what isn't psychology, and we want to narrow the focus. And then finally, the total denial, and again, I've mentioned this already a couple of times, of mental or cognitive processes, which is going to actually lead to reaction and the onslaught. And as you can see, it spurs neo-behaviorism. And so, which is actually it's so wordy, it's going to get translated by most historians in psychology as what we call today cognitive psychology. And so when you swing the pendulum too far in one direction, oftentimes there might be an overreaction or an overcorrection, and Skinner was the guy that pushed this thing as far as he possibly could, and was very narrow, very rigid. Even to his dying days, he was very anti-cognitive psychology, did not like the direction that psychology was going. He actually won a Lifetime Achievement Award from the American Psychological Association 11 days before he dies. And he's there giving a speech, and I actually have the speech somewhere on videotape. I could clearly show parts of it in class someday if you'd like to see it. And he just rips cognitive psychology a new one. In fact, as he's speaking, you can hear gasps in the audience because people, cognitive psychologists in 1990 just can't believe how Skinner is throwing away the work that's been done in cognitive psychology since the mid to late 1960s. And so even to his dying days, he was very much, very, very radical, very extremist in his positions about, what psychologists could study and what contributions psychology